Hello everyone, welcome to BISP Solutions. I am Preeti working here as Oracle Fusion Functional Consultant. So we will today discuss the rest of the setups that we have to do in the project portfolio management module. So these are the day one topics that we have discussed. So these are the topics that we have covered till date. And now today we will discuss the rest of the topics. So let's take an overview. What are the topics for today? Today we will discuss what is the revenue categories and how to create that in the application, what is the use of expenditure categories, what are the bases that you can use for unit of measure, then you will see what is the use of expenditure type class. Now, for creating any transaction in the project, in the Oracle Fusion project portfolio management, you have to create certain configurations which includes revenue category, expenditure category, unit of measure, expenditure type class. Now, these all are the mandatory setups. We will go one by one and see what are the use of these setups in the Oracle project. So, what is revenue category and what is the use of it? A revenue category describes a source of revenue for the organization and helps to classify revenue stream. So when you create the transaction in the project and you generate the revenue from that transaction, it transfer to general ledger. When it transfer to general ledger, what happens? General ledger will automatically link one revenue category. So we create the revenue category so that system should know from which source and against which source you are generating the revenue. Revenue categories are used for grouping expenditure types and event types for revenue and billing. You can use revenue categories for budgeting, for reporting purposes, and in your auto accounting rules. Auto accounting rules means in the configuration for subledger accounting. Revenue categories are also used for grouping expenditure types for revenue and billing. You have to assign at least one revenue category to each expenditure type and event type. You can see here I have attached one image. This is how revenue category page looks like, and these are the revenue category name you can see here: fee, labor, other, payment. What kind of revenue it is? You have to mention it in the revenue category configuration. Whenever we are recognizing the revenue from project, system will link one revenue category automatically when it is transferring it to general ledger. So for example purpose, when you are creating a billing project, you have two tasks, major tasks. One is you have to raise the customer invoice and you have to recognize the revenue against those invoices. So when you are creating the transaction, it is transferred to general ledger and then it is recognized the revenue. Therefore, system need to know that against which expenditure type revenue is recognizing and which type of revenue it is. Now I will move to the application to see how to create the revenue category. When you create the revenue category, you have to assign the same while creating the expenditure type, and expenditure type is a very mandatory setup. Without creating the expenditure type, you won't be able to create the transaction in the project resource, and without creating the revenue category, you won't be able to create the expenditure type. So for creating the revenue category, you have to go to setup and maintenance. You will find all these setups in the project foundation functional area. Here in the setup area, you have to select project financial management. Now go to project foundation functional area. You can see here, these are the required tasks and creating revenue category, expenditure type is the required task. That means they are the mandatory task. Now click on this manage revenue categories task. So you can see here, Oracle also provides some predefined revenue categories. So the revenue categories which are beginning with the code ORA are the revenue categories which are defined by the Oracle itself. If you want to use these categories in your project, you can simply select it in your expenditure type, or you can define your own revenue category. You can see here, this is the lookup, and this lookup configuration level is extension. It means you can add your own values. Now for creating the new one, you have to click on this create icon. Just because the lookup configuration level is extension, that's why you can add your own value, or you can see you can define your own value as per your business requirement. So for creating the new revenue category, you have to click on this create icon. Here you have to give the name of your revenue category. Here you have to select the start date. I am taking it as the 1st January 23. Give the meaning of it. Then give the description. Click on create icon again. So it is not allowing to have meaning same as other revenue category which is already created in the system. So I'm changing it. Select the date here. Again, click on create icon. So what is time and material? Time and material, when you are charging your project on the basis of hours invested, on that time you will use this time and material concept. Say you have worked on your project for 20 hours, then you will do the billing on the basis of those 20 hours. It means it works on the hours basis. select the date here. So we have created three revenue categories. Now we have to click on this save and close. Now we will move to our next task, that is expenditure category. But before that, I will discuss with you what is the expenditure type. So expenditure type is the mandatory setup in the projects. For creating the expenditure type, there is some prerequisite setups to be done in the application. Before creating the expenditure type, you need to create these revenue category, expenditure category, unit of measure, expenditure type class, whereas expenditure type class are predefined and unit of measures are also created and it is importing through inventory. But you have to create the revenue category and expenditure categories. So what is expenditure type? Say we have expenditure type as airfare. So where it will fall, into which category it will fall, then we will create the expenditure category, that is travel category. In this way it works. Whatever the expenses we have related to travel, what we will do, we will select the category for those travel expenses as travel category so that it can accumulate at one place only and it will be easily tracked on the basis of travel category. Second example, if we have expenditure type as miscellaneous category, then what will happen? All the miscellaneous expenses will fall into the category called miscellaneous expenses. In this way, it works. And revenue category we have discussed. These are the example of it, that is fees, labor, service fees. Now, what is unit of measure? On which basis you will be able to measure your expenses? Here we will mention, say, if you are measuring the labor, then labor works on hour basis. So we will measure the expenses related to labor into the hours. Say we have any expenses which is related to non-labor expenses. So directly we will enter the amount. That means we are measuring it on the basis of currency. Say we are purchasing any material. So how and on which basis you will measure that material expenses? We will measure it on the basis of each. Say we have purchased 10 equipments, then it will be measured on the basis of each. So now we will go back to our application and we'll create the expenditure categories. Create expenditure categories to group expenditure types for costing. As I told you that we will create the expenditure types and then we will group it into the categories so that it is easily tracked. It will be easy to track those expenses. Now you can see here that expenditure category name is labor, under which all the related costs to labor will be fall. Other expenses, then we will create the expenses if there are other expenses or miscellaneous expenses, and then we will select the category as other expenses. If we have expenses, then we will create the category name as expenses and all the expenses will be grouped into the expenses category. If we have any expenses that is related to use of fixed asset, we will take expenditure category as chargeback and all the expenses related to fixed asset will be fall under this category called chargeback. Then we will create the category as services. Then all the expenses related to services will fall under this expenditure category name, that is services. We will move to our application to see how it will create practically in the application. You can see here the task, that is manage expenditure categories. Click on this task. So these are the already created expenditure categories. If you want to use this existing expenditure category, you can use it. And for creating the new expenditure category, you have to click on this create icon. Say I am creating the labor category. Give the name here. Select the date here. Giving the finishing date is not mandatory. Now creating the new one, you have to click on this create icon. Let's create miscellaneous expenses. Select the date here. Start date is mandatory, but finish date is not mandatory. It's optional. So we have created three expenditure categories. That is labor category, miscellaneous expenses, travel category. Let's create one more. So whatever the non-labor expenditure we will create, it will fall into this category. Select the date. So we have created four expenditure categories. Now click on save and close. Now we will move to our next task, that is required for creating expenditure type, that is manage unit of measure. How you gonna record the transaction of non-labor expenses? Say directly, if you are going to enter the amount, then you will select the currency as your unit of measure. While creating the expenses related to labor, you have to select the hours as your unit of measure. In this way, you will decide how to measure your expenses, on what basis it will be measured. And in the unit of measure, we will not define it because they are already defined through inventory. You can see here, these are all the measurements available. If in case your business requirement is different from the existing unit of measures which are already available in the application, you can create it by clicking on this create icon. You can create your own unit of measure. I'm not defining it because the unit of measure that I need are already created. You can see here it is available in milliliter, grams, kilograms, month, year. You can see here it is available in hours, minute. So if you want to create as per your business requirement, you can create your own unit of measure, but there is no need to define it. Now click on save and close. Now we will move to our expenditure type and we'll see how to assign revenue category, unit of measure, and expenditure category while creating the expenditure type. So this is a very mandatory setup. Click on this task, that is manage expenditure type. So here you can see these are the already created expenditure type. So let's take a overview of one expenditure type. You can see here we have expenditure type name as administrative, and this administrative expenditure type is falling into the expenditure category, that is labor. And we have a revenue category which is also a labor. And now on what basis you will measure this expenditure type? Administrative will be measured into hours because it is related to labor expenditure category. And I told you, when you are talking about labor, it will always measured in terms of hours. Here, giving the start date is mandatory. Again, giving the finish date is not mandatory. Now you have to scroll it down. You can see here below you have to give the expenditure type classes. If you are not assigning any expenditure type class, then you won't be able to use it in projects. Now, what is the use of these expenditure type class? Whenever you are creating the overtime expenses in the project, if you mention it here, then only you will be able to use this expenditure type while creating the overtime expenses. If you will not mention here the expenditure type class as overtime, you won't be able to create the overtime expenses in the project. Now here, you have to assign the set and into which assign set this expenditure type will fall. That means this expenditure type will be allowed to use by the AU, COU, PROJ, RDS. It can be used by common RDS, and also it can be used by CONSERV Only the reference data set that you have assigned here, those RDS will be able to use these expenditure type. Is the necessity of this configuration, because if you are not assigning any expenditure type class, then you won't be able to use it in the project. Now you can see the star mark with expenditure category, revenue category, and unit of measure. So before creating the expenditure type, it is required or prerequisite to create the expenditure category, revenue category, and unit of measure. Without creating these three, you won't be able to create your expenditure type. Now for creating the new expenditure type, we have to click on this create icon. Now give the name of your expenditure type. So I am taking it as airfare, and I will assign the category to it as travel category. So whenever you will create airfare expenditure in your project, it will fall into the expenditure category, that is travel category. Now you will be able to see the category that we have created. So this is the travel category that we have created. Click on OK. Now what is the revenue category? Now by incurring this kind of expense, what kind of revenue will be generated from this expense? You have to mention it here. So I am taking it as service fees earned. Now what will be the unit of measure for this expense? I will directly enter the amount for this expense. So I am taking it as currency. One thing you have to keep in mind that once you save this expenditure type, then you won't be able to change the expenditure category, revenue category, and unit of measure. So while selecting this expenditure category, revenue category, unit of measure for any expenditure type, you have to be more focused because it won't be editable after saving it. Now you have to scroll little down and you have to select the expenditure type class. Now here I will define at what times I have to use this airfare expenditure type. Say I'm creating the supplier invoices in the project. So at the time of creating the supplier invoices, I can use this expenditure type. Now here you have to use the same range of date that you have given here. You can see here if I am taking it as 31st March here and I am will select here as January 1, system will throw the error. You can see here the error. The date range for the expenditure type class falls outside the date range for the expenditure type. The date range for the expenditure type class must fall within the date range for the expenditure type. So whatever the date range you are giving here, your expenditure type class should fall under that only. It will not allow you to save it until you will change the required changes. Again, go to create, and then here, even while creating the miscellaneous transaction, I can use this expenditure type. So I am taking it as miscellaneous transaction here. Here I want only common set to use this expenditure type. Now here you can mention the tax codes. Tax classification codes, it will be decided on the basis of country, business unit, and not on the basis of expenditure type. What are the tax rates that are going in the country or as per the business unit, the location where they are operating, it will be decided on those basis. Right now, I'm not giving these tax classification code. This is not a mandatory one. So I'm leaving it blank. You can fill it out as per your business requirement. Click on save. Now again, click on add. We will create multiple expenditure type. Say PPM cab expenses. I'm selecting PPM travel category for these cab expenses. Taking revenue category as service fees earned. And now how these cab expenses will be measured. I'm selecting it as currency. Give the expenditure type class here. Again, I want to use this cab expenditure while creating the supplier invoices. Let me change the date here. I'm taking it as back date. Even while creating the expense reports, I want to use this cab expenses. Also, while creating the miscellaneous transaction in the project, I can use this cab expenses. It should be allowed to use there. Now, give the reference data set here. I'm using it as common. Again, click on save and then click on create new. Let's create one expenditure type for miscellaneous expenses. So we have created the revenue category for it. Select it here. Sorry, we have selected expenditure category as PPM miscellaneous expenses. Click on unit of measure. Give the expenditure type class for this expenditure type. Say I want to use this while creating the supplier invoice in the system, while creating the project transactions. Now we will create some expenditure type related to labor. Select the expenditure category here. We have created the category for labor and non-labor expenses. So let's select the category that we have created for labor. Let's take this category into the time and material earning PPM revenue category. So now what will be the unit of measure for labor? We have discussed that it is measured into hours. So I will select here the unit of measure as hours. Click on OK. Change the date here. Select the expenditure type class. Now this is the labor transaction. And at what time you want to use this labor? When you are creating the straight time expenses and overtime expenses. In case you didn't mention the overtime at the time of creation this expenditure type class, then you won't be able to create overtime expenses for the labor. So it is very mandatory to mention it here. Now, while creating the expenditure type class for labor, I will select overtime as well as straight time. So that while creating either of them or both of them, it will be able to be selected while creating the project transaction. Again, click on it and select overtime. There's one more option. You can create the overtime labor expenses separately also. So what we will do, we are mentioning it here also, but if you want to select the expenditure category or expenditure type as overtime separately, then you can create one expenditure type as overtime. This is just the way out, or you can see the say the this is the only second method to create the overtime expenses for non-labor or for labor. Click on create icon and select the reference data set here. Click on create icon. Let's create labor for external purpose now. Whenever we will use labor transaction for internal project purpose, we will use this expenditure type. And whenever we are creating transactions related to external labor or external project, then we will use this expenditure type. So I'm creating two type of labor, that is one is internal and the second one is external. But both will fall under same category. It will group under same category. This is just the bifurcation of expenditure type. One is internal and the other one is external, but it will club into the category that is called labor category. Like the revenue category, again, it will be measured in hours. Like the date here, also give the overtime, mention the reference data set. Now, as I told you, there is one more way to create the expenditure type for overtime. One is you can mention it in expenditure type class while creating the internal labor or external labor expenditure types. But there is one more way. You can create the overtime expenditure type separately, which you can use for anything. That means if you are incurring any overtime expenses for even non-labor expenses, then also you can use that overtime expenditure type. And if you are using for labor, then also you can use that overtime expenditure type for it. So let's make one expenditure type as overtime. It will be measured on the basis of hours. Take the expenditure type class for it as overtime. Give the reference data set as common. Click on save. So we cannot leave blank this field, and I don't know why it is not accepting make any changes. Let's click on cancel and then come back to this task again. Let's search it out with PPM. We didn't save our overtime expenditure type. Let's create again. Change the date here. Check the overtime here. And then assign the reference data set here. Click on create icon. Create the next expenditure type. So if you are purchasing any material for the project, how it will be measured and what will be the expenditure type for it. Say I want this material expenditure to be fall into the expenditure category as miscellaneous expenses, and it should be recognized as time and material. And for material, I can use the unit of measure as each. Let's search it out here. Change the date here. So here you can see the option inventory available, and we can use it for material expenses. Let's create one expenditure type for usage. Now, what is usage? Usage are the expenses which are related to non-labor resource, and it means the equipment. Say if we are providing the equipment which is chargeable on the basis of hours, we can create the expenditure type, or we are taking any usages from any other operating unit or from external source, and you want to create the expenditure type for that particular usage, that means for that equipment, then we will create the expenditure type. Then what will be the expenditure category for it? We will take it as miscellaneous expenses. Say I'm taking the expenditure category for this usage expenditure type as miscellaneous expense, and what will be the revenue category? Say I will recognize at fees earned. Then what is the unit of measure? Say we are paying the expenses for the usage on the basis of hours, then we can select it here as hours. Say if you are paying the amount fixed amount, then you can select the currency also. But right now I'm selecting it as hours. Say I am taking any equipment on rent from external source and I have to pay 100 rupees per hour and I'm using that equipment for 10 hours, then I have to pay 1000. But what is the unit of measure? We are paying it on the basis of hours. Say we have taken it on rent and we have to pay fixed amount of 2000 rupees. Then what we will select here? We will select it here as currency. So right now I'm taking it as hour. Select the date here. Select the expenditure type class here. You can find usage expenditure type class here. So this is the one. Assign the reference data set. Click on create icon again. Now I will create one expenditure type for overheads that is called burden in the projects. Select the expenditure category for this burden expenditure type. Now select the revenue category. I'm selecting it as fees earned. Now what will be the unit of measure for this? I will take it as currency. I'm paying the fixed amount for this burden or overhead, so I'm selecting it as currency. Change the date here. So we have a separate expenditure type class for burden transactions that I'm selecting here. And now you have to assign the set. Let's take it as common. Click on save and close. Now you can see here that we have created multiple expenditure types, and this we will use in our project as transaction. So you have to create the revenue category, unit of measure, expenditure category, and then we have to assign all three of them while creating the expenditure type. And expenditure type is a very mandatory setup without which you cannot create the transaction in your projects. So we have completed the topics that we have taken for today. We have seen how to create the revenue category, expenditure category, unit of measure, and how to assign all three of them in the expenditure type class. And we have discussed what is the use of creating expenditure type class. Thank you so much for joining today's session. Have a good day.